Hello and welcome to another episode here of the Wars Rebellion podcast for Age Civil War. And today, coming from, I guess, in both our cases, somewhat snowy regions of the world, I have a very special guest here for us today. And before I forget, as I usually do, I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn. And I am joined today by Sydney Nasons. He is in the wonderful mountains of Colorado today with me, and he is an extraordinarily published historian. Now, we're going to start at the very beginning, 1969, Johns Hopkins University, where he got his PhD, and he has been authoring a good number of books, which include, but are not limited, I suppose, Daniel Webster and Jacksonian Democracy, The Quest for Progress, The Way We Live in North Carolina, To Free a Family, A Mind to Stay, White Plantation and Black Homestead, and the one we are going to talk about today, the newest one, and I will say an extraordinarily interesting one, Freedom's Mirage. Virgil Bennehan's Odyssey from Emancipation to Exile with the University of North Carolina Press, came out just this past November 2024. First of all, Sydney, thank you so much, and to your wife for all her help for joining me tonight.
I'm honored to be here.
Very great pleasure. And well, I forgot to mention that you also worked at Duke University Press for a few years. And so let's start with you obviously wrote a lot during this sort of antebellum Jacksonian period. How did you find Virgil and decided Virgil needed a book?
So the origin story on my last three books actually goes back to the first. That's 50 years. And 50 years ago, I wrote this book on Daniel Webster and Jacksonian democracy. And Daniel Webster was one of the great senators of the antebellum era. He and Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun were known as the Great Triumvirate. And he was also known as the most renowned orator of his day. And Jackson was the greatest and the most important president. I'll say most important. Not everybody thinks he's the greatest, but certainly the most important president between Jefferson and Lincoln.
Mhm.
So this was a story of major leaders of American politics. And at the time that that book came out, in 1973, the winds of the historical profession were changing and moving from great leaders to ordinary people. And the praise then was from the top down to the bottom up. And I decided that was the kind of history I wanted to move to. And the mission there was to do a more democratic story of American history, not just the leaders, but ordinary people. And as it turned out, at the same time, African American and Southern African American history were part of that more democratizing impulse. And as it turned out, 12 miles from where I lived was a Stagville plantation, which is where Virgil Bennehan was born and where the people on the other books that I wrote about in what turned out to be a trilogy, Mary Walker, the escaped slave, and Paul Hargis, the man who was sent out to Alabama, all were on that plantation. And 12 miles south were the papers of the planter who owned these people. 30,000 letters at the Southern Historical Collection. So things aligned, and there was a great issue at that time, 50 years ago. And the issue was, what was the impact of slavery on the Black family? And what was that impact on families in freedom?
Mhm.
And the ruling notion was destruction, that the humiliation of sale, separation, rape, all those things just undermined the possibility of connections of Black people to family members because they could be separated at any time, they could be invaded at any time, they could be killed at any time. And there was a historian named Herbert Gutman who'd taken on that whole question, and his book came out in 1976. And that was really the hook for me. Could I find within the story of the Stagville people and the Cameron letters, some stories that would deal with that question, an open question, still an open question, of whether the Black family had survived an attachment to Black family, had survived the nemesis of slavery. So that was the origin story of those last three books. The book To Mind to Stay, the book Mary Walker, To Free Your Family, and the Virgil book. And in both of the first two books, one came out in 2012, the other 2017, I found what I would call William Dean Howells kind of stories, tragedies with a happy ending. That's what he said Americans liked in plays and by
Yeah.
extension in history. Tragedy, of course, was slavery. But in the case of people sent out to Alabama in 1844, ultimately those people bought the plantation after the Civil War. They survived and they committed themselves to do that. And in the story of To Free a Family, a woman escaped slavery, but she's fought hard to get her family behind and finally got two of her children behind after 1865. So in 2017, the question was, I'm 77 years old. Did I have one more book in me? And I thought, maybe. I knew that this story of Virgil was there, uh, but it was different from all the other stories. And what I knew about Virgil ended with two words written in a letter in 1856. Poor Virgil. So I thought, well, this one might not have a happy ending. And in fact, it was a complicated story, and I wasn't sure I wanted to take it on, but I decided to push ahead and push my luck. So that is the long story, and not a short one, but not the long story short. That's just the long story of the origin of these three books, which are all connected with Stagville in the Southern Historical Collection. 12 miles one way, 12 miles another way.
I'm envious. I always had thousands of miles to get to my research usually. It's nice when you have it next door. And so just fascinating how like one leads to the other. And I'm glad you got the Virgil book out. It's an extraordinary interesting story you have to tell. But and you mentioned it a few times in the book, I noticed. You talk about how difficult it was to tell the story. What did you find was the kind of most challenging aspect of trying to tell Virgil's story?
Well, the first challenge was that Virgil's story didn't match up with a lot of the other stories,
Hmm.
in the sense that Virgil was an exception on every count. So Virgil was a privileged bondsman.
Hmm.
Okay. And some would say that's an oxymoron. Virgil referred to his master in one crucial letter, which I'll talk about, as a friend, master and friend. Well, how about that? Virgil was a doctor on the plantation, an enslaved man who was a doctor. Virgil was a man who thought of himself as a friend to blacks and whites alike. Really? Owners, overseers, and enslaved people? Virgil was emancipated and immediately exiled. Virgil went to Liberia and had entrees to the leaders of Liberia, and 6 months later, he comes back. Virgil doesn't just come back as a free man, he comes back as a man who goes back to North Carolina and, according to his former owner, sought to be re enslaved. And he's refused. And the last thing we hear is he's headed out to California in 1849, but in fact, he's listed in the census in Baltimore in 1850. So everything about Virgil's story seemed to be exceptional. Okay. So I felt that was a challenge. If you were going to first explain each of these exceptions, and you might call them paradoxes, and second, if you're going to find any kind of larger significance in them. And of course, the third thing, which I mentioned right at the first, is that as far as sources are concerned, I only had one letter that Virgil wrote that was self-disclosing. He wrote a couple of others in the context of talking about the health of people he was caring for, but one letter from him. So could you write a biography with one letter? Other than that,
Well,
nothing problem.
you did. I mean, that's the beauty, right? Sometimes it's just creatively looking for other things and reading between the lines, and you still write a biography. And You accomplished that.
Well, Virgil's letter didn't stand alone. So
Right.
I've been working in these papers at the Southern Historical Collection, 12 miles from where I lived. And even when I moved to Denver, we'd go back there from time to time, darkening those doors for 40 years. I knew a lot
Mm-hmm.
about the world he lived in. I had 9 quote boxes that size, 5 by 8
Mm-hmm.
cards, full of notes made on everybody on the plantation. I had stacks and stacks and stacks of photocopies. And thank God they were cheaper to make in those days.
Oh, yes.
Now you can't even make them. You have to photocopy because they don't want the documents damaged, which I understand. But I had reams of those. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so I knew a lot about his world, and I knew I had a wonderful book written by a friend and a fellow historian, Gene Anderson, called Piedmont Plantation, which really focused mostly on the white folks, but had some good
Right
information
here.
about Virgil. There you go, you got it. And Gene's is fabulous, meticulous research on the acquisition of land, on the acquisition of enslaved people, on the overseers. So I could turn to that, and I did turn to that for all three of those books. So I knew a lot about the world, but still, the challenge was to first work with that letter and mine that letter for everything it was worth there to
Mm-hmm.
see if I could extract uh, questions
Right.
about Virgil and come up with answers. And of course, the first thing that I had to deal with was the letter. This is a letter written from Liberia,
Mm-hmm.
1848, and it begins with 6 words: "My dear young master and friend." And it's addressed to a man named Paul Cameron, who was born the same year, 3 months earlier than he was, in the same plantation, who inherited the plantation. "My dear young master and friend." So that was the start. Okay, a master and a friend and a master.
Mm-hmm.
Don't see those two things joined very often.
No.
So, but I had that letter to work with, and he named
Mm-hmm.
the names of people, other people he thought were his friends. He named the names of whites that his overseers, whom he called neighbors, not overseers. And he listed the people he met in Liberia, the Declaration of Independence author, the Secretary of State, the brother of the president. And I thought, well, I can work with, I'm a researcher. I can work with that.
Yeah.
Who the hell were these people? And it sort
Right.
of specified a lot about Virgil's world. So now I'm not just dealing with the world of the plantation. I'm dealing with Virgil's world. Those people
Mm-hmm.
he named as his friends, the
Right.
overseers he named as his neighbors, and the people he met in Liberia.
Mm-hmm.
So I had something to work with from that later.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting when you kind of have that little piece, and then you can branch out into all kinds of different directions then from there. And you also, so at which point did you discover that other letter with the poor Virgil that you already mentioned? Was it very early on in the research? Was it late in the research? Or was it sort of an accidental find? How did you come across that one?
It was in Gene Anderson's book. So I knew
Okay.
it from the first. I knew the
Okay.
first that was going to be the outcome. And
Okay.
this was not likely to be a tragedy with a happy ending.
Yeah.
And that, as I explained in the acknowledgments, is a challenge for me
Hmm.
because I had a colleague who said, "Well, Sid, you know, you write about the atoms of history." He said. Larry Goodwin was a colleague at Duke, and Larry wrote big books. And he said, "I like what you do." He said, "But you tend to go for triumph." And Larry was a military man's son, and he used to say that he thought most accounts of history were as military music is to war, and he thought slavery
Hmm.
was war,
Hmm.
and and he thought most stories, including the one he wrote about, which was populist in the 19th century, and in tragedy. And he said, you ought to consider that. And I balked at that, but that was what looked like it was going to fall into my lap. And I thought, well, man up, man.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
let's see where this goes. I still had to know actually how we get to that point. How does he get from enslaved doctor, master and friend to poor Virgil? How does he get from U.S. to Liberia, back to the
Yeah.
plantation, and maybe to California, and still poor Virgil? I mean, the man traveled 10,000 miles, probably more than any other enslaved man of his time. Uh,
Uh-huh.
and he he rose higher than most enslaved people on the
Right.
plantation, and now poor Virgil. So that was out there, but I knew from the first that I had to find out about that road. I just felt I had to.
Yeah.
I could
Wow.
have retired. I felt my wife thought I should have retired and just traveled, but I thought
Well,
I
you
had
could
one
travel
more
from
book.
Colorado to North Carolina occasionally. It, probably not quite the Caribbean beaches, but well, for researcher and historians, they are just as fun.
Yep.
Uh, and I did like it and really enjoyed how you kind of, even though it is about, well, actually, before I go on, let me ask you, how do you think of this book? Do you see it as a biography, or do you see it in some other genre?
Well, yes and no. Uh, it it is
Trick
it is
question.
it is a biography. It is a biography, uh, but it turns out that when I made that, let me go back to the shift that I made in the 70s.
Hmm.
So one of the one of the ways in which people were doing the lives of ordinary Americans and doing history from the bottom up and democratizing
Hmm.
American history was to do community studies,
Hmm.
small studies, large
Hmm.
stories written small. So one of the most famous and most successful of these is a book by John Demos called A Little Commonwealth, in which he looks at Plymouth and he looks at the material culture
Hmm.
of those early settlers there and just comes up with a huge story of how they actually lived day to day, week to week to month. Uh, there's a woman who did um, Laurel Ulrich did a story of a midwife. She used the diary of a
Hmm.
midwife,
Yeah.
the 17th century, and just came up with a story not just of midwifery, but also of women and of the lives that they led of medicine there. Uh, Steve Thornton did a book on Newburyport, looked at social mobility. He took Henry George's famous phrase, progress and poverty, and turned it around, poverty and progress, and looked at the issue of social mobility. So I thought, okay, why not make Stagville my little community study?
Right.
And I only later did I learn when one of these books was reviewed what I was doing. I was doing micro history. And I thought, oh, really? I didn't know that
Hmm.
that was I thought it was community. I thought it was a form of community studies. So I would say that Virgil's story is both a biography and a micro history.
Hmm.
It is his story as much as I could ferret out, but it's
Right.
also a story, as it turned out, of the plantation he lived
Hmm.
on.
Yeah.
It's also a story of mastery, if you might call it that. It's
Hmm.
also a story of the experience of enslavement,
Hmm.
writ small in this one place. And as it turned out, I think that Virgil's story really reveals something of the
Hmm.
changes in all of these over time.
Yeah.
So it's both to me. It's micro history, but it's also telling it through the biography of Virgil.
Hmm. Yeah, and the part where I kind of stopped myself that I really enjoyed was also that you kind of there was a little bit of detective story in there that you kind of talked about like, ooh, now I found this and there's this now I'm pursuing. So it kind of felt it was really nice, especially for like I kind of felt like this was a great book for an undergraduate class because it sort of gives them a little bit of like, where do you find this? Where all of a sudden does a person you're looking for pops up, right? I think you mentioned it when we're getting ahead a little bit. California, and you type in Virgil's name with various alterations, and he pops up in the newspaper all of a sudden, right? And that kind of makes it from a research, how do you do it? How do you write this? A really interesting book as well.
Well, I have to say that this research, like any of my research, is not linear.
No,
Okay,
I can imagine.
and I'm not sure anybody's is, but mine is most certainly not. If you could have seen my study, you would have seen that confirmed. I had to make the story linear, but for me,
Mm.
again, going back to the 70s, even that Daniel Webster book began as a footnote.
Mm.
I admit it. I'm a footnote chaser. Ambulance chasers, I think, are not have a bad rep. Footnote chasers, maybe not so much. And Daniel Webster book began in a footnote in a book written by the man who turned out to be my dissertation advisor, David Donald, and his book had just won the Pulitzer Prize, and I
Well,
had
somewhere
taken
up there behind me.
and I thought, and that seminar I was in summer school, you had to come up with a topic at the end of the first week. So I ran through that footnote, and there was ran through that book, and there was a little footnote. Nobody knew about the split between Daniel Webster and a man named Abbott Lawrence, who was his financial backer. And
Hmm.
today the agreement would be when we're going to be reading about the split between Donald Trump and Elon Musk. You know, it's going to
Right,
happen. And then the people are going to say, what happened?
right.
The guy who backed him and bankrolled him, what happened to him? So
Hmm.
this was the equivalent. And so I went after that, having having come up with the end of 3 weeks, and I found the answer. Okay, and this gave me an article of faith: research and ye shall find. Okay, and in each of these books that came after that,
Hmm.
the book about those people who went out to Alabama in 1844, I went out there on a lark, really, and found an oral historian who opened up the story of the Great Migration that they experienced and what impact it
Hmm.
had, and then the rest of the story. And then to free a family, I pursued the question of what happened to this woman who escaped slavery, name is Mary Walker, and wound up in Philadelphia and then finally in Boston. And it turned out that the letters of the family that took her in were in private hands. And I wrote those people. And the next thing I knew, I was the first one to use those letters, and her story just unfolded. So this all confirmed that. The problem with Virgil was where where was the oral history?
Right.
He wasn't. Where was the attic trunk full of his letters? There were none. So, but I had this tailwind researching the issue of flight. I'd had good luck, and I decided to push my luck one more time.
Yeah. And
So,
you got about 20 pages out of
but
it,
then,
which is
but then
perfect.
getting back to your point, Niels, in the meantime, history had become not just archival but digital, and
Yes.
so when Virgil's name would pop up, as you put it, every once in a while, I was googling around, and all of a sudden, in the records newspaper in California, his name pops up, and in the cemetery records, his name pops up, but I didn't go out to California for that. Actually, I did go out to California one time and tried to do some research on microfilm, and I gave it up about an hour. But in the meantime, digitization came in. So
Right.
it was just one of the great boons that helped me out.
Yeah, I know that feeling. I think I have a microfilm. It's one of those Exile on my shelf. From the Palmerston Papers in Southampton. Guess what? They're online now. Like, great, great. It's great what is available these days online, I have to
And I
admit.
and I had the benefit of other people who'd done research
Hmm.
following me and Gene Anderson on Stagville. And there
Right.
was one person, Chris Hughes, who actually went through the entire corpus of papers, taking down every
Ooh.
item, every fact about every enslaved person. And then it was put into a
Mm.
compilation. So basically, I had my own, and then I got that from Stagville. They let me have a copy of that was printed up. And so
Wow.
when Virgil named the names of people who were his friends, I was able to look them up and then find out what roles they had
Hmm.
on the plantation. And when you put it all together, you found out there was a pattern here. These were the people who were basically in the slaveholders hierarchy in the
Hmm.
plantation. So there were other aids that I had.
Yeah, no, sometimes you just have to be lucky about it.
Yep.
So let's get into the Virgil story because we've been talking about sources, and I know people, and you are very anxious about talking about him because he's such a fascinating character. So the you kind of opens the book with a very interesting situation, and that's the record of the enslaved people at Stagville, and that most of them are only recorded with like a birth year, but you have an exception with Virgil.
Right. So they were, you have these lists of people who were enslaved called slave inventories, and they were done every year. And they were basically done for tax purposes. They're listed, everybody over 12 and under 65 or 50, I don't know what the limit was, got taxes. So government used these to identify naming patterns.
Mhm.
And I went to some of these originals, and it turned out this is the first exception. Everybody else is listed either by year of birth, sometimes by age, where you have to extrapolate the year. Virgil
Mhm.
is listed by December 24th, 1808.
Hmm.
He's the first. And,
Wow.
you know, it could be a coincidence, Christmas Eve. It could be something more, that
Right.
he was more listed for more reasons than that. And ultimately, I conclude that he may have been listed for more reasons than that because he was the son of the planter. But I had to prove that, prove it, proof. I don't do DNA. You know, we don't do exhumations. I don't know where Virgil wound up. You know, nothing could be proven in the conventional sense.
Right.
But I put circumstantial evidence uh, together. But that was the first exception there. And then he's trained in accounts. He's trained in literacy. He's trained to be a doctor. He's freed by his owner. Things begin to line up. And there
Mhm.
was a woman named Jones who actually did a book on it, Slaveholders of Masters of Conscience, she called it, in which he talks about the way in which owners who had enslaved children who cared for them often gave them special roles and equally often freed them. So it seemed to fit into a pattern there.
Right.
But that was where it started, Niels.
Yeah, and that was sort of an interesting story to start with because you kind of raise a question of like why just this person, right? Why not everyone? Why just why Virgil this special treatment? And as you say, that special treatment continues. So like is he then like I mean we have to speculate, and that's sort of part of what makes your book also very interesting because there's you have to speculate about some of the things because you're not going to have the answer. But do you feel like this was like he is picked and then like the obviously his enslavers grooming him for certain roles? Could there have been ever like a moment where he was just like, no, I'm not going to be the medic, or no, I'm not going to do this. Like, I don't want to be that special person.
Never thought of that. I have not come across any of that. That would
Hmm.
be that would have been even more fascinating than what I did find. Um, he might have he might have come to that question as he grew up, because of course it puts him in a separate position than most of the other enslaved people.
Hmm.
And you know, it's not you can be the master's favorite, but that puts you at odds in principle with being the favorite or even trusted by
Right.
your fellow enslaved people. And I had to deal with this question. I'm sure like no one will think I resolved it satisfactorily. I think some people automatically assume that anybody who is the master's favorite, who pet, if you want to call him that,
Hmm.
would be suspect on the part of the other people and would be looked upon with suspicion, distrust. As a collaborator, as a guy who sold his soul, I mean, you could pile up the antipathies there. And he may secretly have felt that at some point. How do I do this if I and
Hmm.
maintain dual loyalty? And that was a
Hmm.
question that came up for me. To me, that is really the obverse of the question that you're asking there.
Hmm.
Can I be looked upon as a friend to all? And he literally
Right.
uses that phrase,
Yeah.
friend to all, in his letter. My greetings to these 14 named people and 100 more friends that I could name. Well,
Right.
okay, so apparently he managed to resolve that, and somehow, and the way I speculate, Niels, uh, is to note that he is orphaned. His mother
Hmm.
dies when he's 12, and I decided his father took over. His grandfather took over, grooming
Hmm.
him
Yeah.
and raising him and modeling for him how you can have this kind of dual loyalty. And that required a lot of speculation. This man's name was Philip Meeks. And here's the other, let's say, very small tidbit from which I extrapolated a large speculation. When Virgil is that letter from writes that letter from Liberia, he signs it. This is the first time he signs his full name. In those little letters to
Mm,
his master when he's enslaved, just reporting on the health of people,
mhm,
it's always Virgil, dear master and Virgil. This one
mhm,
starts, dear master and friend, and he signs it Virgil PM, initials Bennehan.
mhm,
PM are the initials of his grandfather. And I
mhm,
think, as I see it, in that signature, he's expressing his dual
mhm.
identification. Virgil
Right,
and Bennehan, his white father, Thomas D. Bennehan,
right,
and Virgil P.M. Bennehan, Philip Meeks there.
right.
So it's a it's a stretch of about 2 miles. But then I looked, okay, so who was this Philip Meeks, and why would I think he would be a person to be a model?
Right.
And I look at his upbringing, and I look at his
Mm,
choices, and I look at the families that he has within slavery, and look at his relationship to his owner, and I decided this man worked it out and gave
mhm,
Virgil a way to work it out. So I guess the roundabout answer to your question, I don't give linear answers either, is that uh, I think that, however, whether Virgil ever questioned whether he wanted to be this person,
mhm.
and especially whether he could be what the owner wanted to be and still have a relationship of mistrust with his enslaved black fellows. Uh, I worked that out through Philip Meeks, his grandfather, and he provided speculation.
And unfortunately, I mean, unfortunately, we have to do that sometimes.
Yeah,
Uh, so, but in many ways, I think this is an interesting point that you're raising, right? Because you're you're kind of looking at a person that does medical care on the plantation. So in part, the patients, the other enslaved people who come to him, need to trust him in that he provides good care. But the master also needs to trust him that if somebody is trying to malinger or fake an illness, that he's not protecting them. So it's a really tough kind of tough situation. And obviously we don't have like all the things we have today with sort of privacy protection that a doctor would have done. So it's like bookkeeper, right? That's a very different world. But and we have to talk about it a little bit because he's also very influential in that. But medicine seems like the most challenging when it comes to like wanting to be friends on both sides.
yeah. And there is an instance where he and the overseer disagree about whether he is really sick or malingering. And Virgil says, I think he's putting it on, and he should go back to work. The overseer says, no, I think he's sick and he should just stay in bed. So
Mm,
there is that dispute there. And there's no question that when people were restored to health, they're expected to be restored there. I don't think that they knew any different, expect anything else, really. I think they
mm,
understood that, and that Virgil was not the one making them go back to work. He could have been perhaps helping them stay away from work, but that wouldn't have lasted very long. But he had to make that choice, and they had to make the decision. Okay, is this guy just a company doctor?
right.
And there was no question he was a company doctor.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the way in which medical care worked, at least on this plantation, involved several steps, but the ultimate step was a very close, intimate care of the person, especially very sick people, to see that they got well and to stay with them if they ultimately were going to not get well. Uh, so the first step is that I had to deal with is, what is the importance of doctoring in this plantation? And one of the things that I found was that this plantation, we think of plantation expansion, we think of the expansion of the plantation from east to west, from North Carolina to Alabama, Mississippi. But long before that, plantations expanded adjacently, next
Mhm.
door, next door, next door. And in this case, they expanded to places where there were creeks and rivers. And so as they expanded, they cleared the land and then in turn uh, worked that land. And the one thing that they also created was a model environment and a trace increase in six that accompanies the acquisition of adjacent lands and clearing of those lands via the plantation. And it affects the planter too, who has to get out of town to get himself cured. So who's going to be there on the plantation? Who's going to look after people? And it turns out to be Virgil. Okay, so the care that they give is that the minute somebody's sick, they decide, are these malarial symptoms going to worse, go to fever, go to the brain, or are they going to be subside? And
Mhm.
if they're not going to subside, then the care is pretty intimate and pretty unpleasant. You know, they're given either a laxative or something that makes them throw up. The carer, whether it's Virgil or whether it's a doctor or whether it's the owner, sit around and wait for the action to take place for them to vomit or for them to fill a bedpan, you know, and then they think the bad humors are out. So it's pretty unpleasant. And I'm not sure they're happy to see the doctor coming. On the other hand, they don't want the chills to get worse. Uh, and when somebody really sick, they send them to the kitchen, the dwelling, the main, which is acts as a kind of intensive care unit, and just stay
Mhm.
with them
Right.
until death do us part, until they get better. So there's no question they cared about health, you know, and they wanted people to think, hey, they're not going to be, this is, and those importation, so they're not going to be able to import people. They have to keep the people they have healthy. So care is real, and the medical care they provided was intimate, uh, and you couldn't deny that they gave a damn
Mhm.
there, though the ultimate result was going to get back to work. So it was complicated. Uh,
Yeah. On the other hand, it's when you think about it, it's brilliant, right? Like instead of having a doctor come out every time, you have your own medical staff on plantation. Um, even if it's not a like properly fully trained medical staff, but it's still something. Do you like speaking of, do you feel like because his he's not really his owner, but his young master slash friend, Cameron, do you feel like because both of them had sort of this medical education, quote unquote, does that create sort of a bond between them?
well, within the framework of the medical understanding that they had, I think they had a pretty basic medical education.
Hmm.
So Virgil got training from his owner, Thomas Bennehan,
Hmm.
who also trained Thomas Bennehan also trained his nephew Paul Cameron, who basically
Hmm.
inherits the plantation and
Right.
control over Virgil
Hmm.
ultimately. And they've all then got training from doctors who were pulled in, and
Hmm.
they're right with the doctors when the doctors are called when they say this case is going off the rails. We got to get the doctor in. And that was
Right.
they had gradations. They were sick, very sick, or really ill, you know, and get a doctor when a person is really ill. So they're all watching the doctors. Now their doctors are truly medically trained, but for the kind of care for malaria, basically, or some of these other conventional diseases, I think they all were operating within the same framework. And Virgil knew how to bleed. Neither Paul Cameron nor Thomas Bennehan were bleeders, but Virgil learned from a doctor, Dr. Webb, who lived on the
Mm.
18 miles away at Hillsborough, how to do bleeding. And they were good friends. I mean, he's one of the people when Virgil is freed before he goes to Liberia, he and his wife get into a coach and he goes and stays overnight with Dr. Webb. So I think he got that kind of on the ground training that a physician's assistant would get in our day and could be a good what we would call first medical responder
Yeah.
there. And I think that's the world they operated in. But they're all operating under the humoral theory of disease, which has not yet been discredited, and none of them understands malaria coming from
Mm.
mosquitoes, though they to get the word. You got these places, you're clearing the wrong grounds, you're citing the places wrong. They sort of knew seat of the pants without knowing the theory
Right.
of the transference, what's going on, and some of the settings that produce malaria. So within that world, I think he was pretty well trained with it, and I think it served him well in Liberia when he went to Liberia.
Mhm.
Uh, but he would never have been considered a trained doctor once he went north. Was just too limited in his understanding.
Yeah, yeah, no. Certainly, and that's I think a big flaw that we have to look at in a minute with regard to when he gets his freedom. The other part that you highlight too is that he is not just well respected as a doctor on the plantation, but he also, and remind me, he got a special key, so he was like a very trusted individual on the Stagwell plantation.
He was. Uh, he basically had multiple roles. He was an accountant,
Yeah.
keeping the numbers. I mean, if you, as our president-elect would tell you, if you'd like your accountant to keep the numbers straight, or done, whichever. But you want him to know
Yes.
what you want there.
Yeah.
And Virgil did that. And Virgil was also the person who was the master of the house, so to speak, the head servant of the house when visitors came, and he was commended for doing the honors of the house for a guest when Thomas Bennehan was gone. So he
Mm.
had that role as well. Um,
Uh,
and he lived pretty close to the owner's house, unlike many of the other people. So I think he was trusted. And going back to Philip Meeks, uh, I would say that his backstory fit Virgil's story of being trying to be trusted on both sides. That is, in the case of Philip Meeks, which pushes the story back into the 1770s, he's a young man on the plantation. The War for Independence from Britain is just beginning. The owner goes away to fight a battle, and he says, "Put this guy, whose name they called him by his nickname Scrub, into
mm,
the house and watch him." And Philip Meeks is watching this happen. You run the clock forward 20 years, and there's a horse thief, and he says, "Put Philip Meeks in charge while I'm going after the horse thief." And to
mm,
me, this was a sign that
right.
Philip Meeks made a choice
Mm,
because Philip Scrub escaped eventually, and Philip Meeks made a
mm,
choice. Scrub made an escape. I'm going to go a different route here, and I'm going to prove that I can be trusted.
mm.
So I think that Virgil follows in those footsteps.
Yeah, well, totally. Again, we have to speculate, but that's
If you don't like
a
speculation,
better speculation than the lottery.
don't read this book. But I put a lot of it in the footnotes. I
Yes.
put a lot of it in the footnotes, and not so much of it all in the text.
Right.
If you want to know how did he get there, then the footnotes are about a third of the book. So it's you can find out how I got there, and then decide for yourself.
There you go. There's the story.
Yeah.
So let's then kill off Thomas Bennehan and his last will and testament, which is for Virgil a great thing to happen.
So Thomas Bennehan is his owner, and I argue in the book, probably by circumstantial evidence, probably his father. And Thomas Bennehan is a person who goes to college in the 1790s, and it's a time when there are debates in college about the morality of slavery.
Hmm.
And we know this through the testimony of his cousin, who was a classmate, and writes
Hmm.
him about this. And we know that the cousin, especially, was troubled about the whole question of whether you should enslave people, and finally recommended to himself, though he didn't own slaves, but also to his cousin, I think if you treat them well, they will actually come to love you. I think that's the resolution of this conflict between your self interest, which requires you to exploit these people with no pay, and your conscience, which says, I shouldn't be doing that. You know, so it's obviously preposterous in a sense, but for Thomas Bennehan, and how do you do that? And
Right.
for Thomas Bennehan, the ultimate resolution of a I think a genuine qualm of conscience was medicine. His
Mhm.
found his calling in medicine. If I cared for them physically, if I demonstrated that, uh, then I think they would in turn care for me. And then the other part of the story is that there was a this plantation was big enough and wealthy enough so that even though it acquired lots of enslaved people, it didn't sell them.
Mhm.
It was I posit, now this is another speculation. I posit that there's a kind of unstated pact. And I draw this from a oral history interview that was done in the 20th century by a colleague. She interviewed a woman. She said, well, in that plantation, she's a descendant. She said, they stole your labor, but they kept you together. They
Mhm.
stole your labor, but they kept you together. And to me,
Mhm.
this is the embodiment of that unstated pact. We will steal
Yeah.
your labor. You have to work for us, but we're not going to sell or separate you. We're going to keep your families together.
Mhm.
So I see Thomas Bennehan as represent at least that those strands being a master. And now we get to Virgil.
Mhm.
So Virgil's been trained on this plantation. He thinks this master is of some conviction and conscience, and he's going to be freed. But by that time, 1848, changed from a dozen earlier, all enslaved people who would be freed had to leave the South. That was true in every Southern state. They did not want free blacks to add to the free black population. They regarded them as first bad models to the enslaved people. They regarded them as potentially poor, and therefore homeless people if they didn't make it, or they put them as potential insurgents and incendiaries. So there were lots of reasons. And so in good conscience, you could free them and then send them away. Uh, and his first will, he has two wills. One, he says, I want to free Virgil, and he should go to the north, he should go to Liberia, let him make the choice. And he has Paul Cameron as his nephew as the executor. In the second will, he says that Virgil will go to Liberia and that Paul must free him, otherwise, and send him to Liberia. Otherwise, Paul will not inherit 5,000 acres by
Mhm.
plantation. So this binds them both. And I call
Right.
this chapter Freedom Bound. And it's an ironclad rule. If
Mhm.
Paul Cameron doesn't do this, he loses the 5,000 acres and Virgil loses his freedom. Uh, and I puzzled over this, Niels. What
Yeah.
because Paul Cameron and his uncle had a good relationship, and Virgil and his uncle had a pretty good relationship. And this is a doctor on the plantation. And Paul says to his father, not knowing the provisions of this second will, he said, I think Virgil would like to stay, and I would like him to stay. You know, he's a doctor, and
Yeah.
he and I can trust him. And they find out when the will is open that it's bound on both of them.
Yeah.
So speculation, time for speculation. Why? Why? And
Yeah.
to me, I come up with a couple of answers. First place, I think Thomas Bennehan knew that as long as he was backing Virgil would be acknowledged as a special case, the
Mhm.
doctor as the first man in the plantation by everybody. But what about Paul? Could he rely
Yeah.
on Paul to do that? Maybe yes, maybe no. What if they got into an argument? What if something happened
Right.
between them? And then I, in the meantime, one of the things that happens on this plantation, and I think Joseph Miller, who's this late historian from University of Virginia, is absolutely right. We can't just look at a plantation as static. He
Mhm.
moves in this plantation. And you start out with these men who think of themselves as people of conscience and think of themselves as a calling.
Mhm.
And then Paul Cameron comes into play, and he starts out there, but eventually, and we have an unstated pact that we'll keep you together as long as we can steal your labor. And then Paul Cameron begins to separate people.
Right.
And he gets ambitious. He buys this place in Alabama. He sends 110 people out to Alabama, and he forces separations of families and friends. So all this has happened, and I think Thomas Bennehan says, this is not stable anymore. I
Hmm.
don't think Virgil's going to be safe here, to tell you the
Right.
truth. I don't think he's going to be able to stay in this unique position of dual loyalty, especially if now his loyalty has to be to Paul, who's the man who's sent 110 people to Alabama and broken the pact. So, and again, if you don't like speculation, don't read the book. But if you do like it or want to see how it gets worked out, that's the way I interpret it, because it is a puzzle. It's an
Hmm.
ironclad pact, and to me, there has to be some explanation offered for why he writes that second will.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you also you spend, I think it was 2 or 3 pages on the executor, right? Of like how he's delaying the kind of implementation of the will so that Virgil can make that journey on the next boat to Liberia. Like
Right.
very,
The rule is that you have to be out within a limited period of time. I forget whether it's 3 months, 6 months, 6 weeks. It's a pretty short period of time, and so the delay of executing the will uh, allows Virgil actually time to decide, make arrangements, visit
yeah,
people, uh, and then he has to go, and he does. He does. He has to go, and he goes to Liberia.
yeah. And
So that's
interestingly enough,
that's
we're
the
not,
next step for him.
yeah, and it's interesting because you're where you think Liberia, right, during this period, the American Colonization Society sending people who are free don't want to stay in the United States anymore there. Many of them go to Monrovia, but he goes to, and I'm not sure if it's pronounced the way I'm going to say it, but I'm going to try my best here. Bassa.
Yes, that's
That
the way.
that doesn't seem like a great place to go.
No, well, so as many of your viewers will know, the American Colonization Society is set up to create a place where free blacks can be sent from America by owners who can think they are acting in good conscience.
Hmm.
Some of them, and by hook, crook, treaty, and intimidation, they're able to obtain this piece of Africa. Call it Liberia, call the capital Monrovia, and name it after the president at the time, James Monroe. Uh, and by the time that Virgil is sent there, the colonists from the U.S. are now in charge of the country. They have declared their independence in 1847. He goes in 1848. So they have even more reason to think
Right.
not only the blacks in the South, but even for blacks in the North who are
Mhm.
experiencing racism everywhere
Right.
would be better off in Liberia, their own country, with their own
Mhm.
country, former slaves now leading the country. So that's the circumstance under which he goes to Liberia. Now, I see the answer to your question. There's Monrovia, which is the capital, and the lands around Monrovia are very fertile, and he sees some of those lands. And there's Bassa, which is a colony that was established in Liberia before independence by Quakers
Mhm.
from Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. And it was designed to be on Quaker principles: no drinking, no slave trading, no weapons. Well,
The last one is
when
a
they
little tough.
yeah, so they are disarmed in every sense and out of sorts with a slave trading area, and the first colony is just wiped out basically.
Right.
And the patrons of that mission want to start again, and they finally persuade the American Colonization Society to back it. And Virgil happens to be endorsed by one of those people, Elliot Cresson, the leader of the Young Men's Colonization Society of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, to be part of the first group of people to be sent to Bassa. So his he has patrons and endorsers, Duncan Cameron, his Elliot Cresson, other people, uh, whom make him a very prominent member of the people who were sent over with his ship in 1848. He meets the leaders of the republic, but he's scheduled to go to Bassa to be part of that group. He's a doctor. He's well-to-do. He's well patronized. He's got money. So they want him to go to Bassa. And Bassa is, let's say, understaffed place with doctors. Doesn't have any doctors. It turns out that the instructions to get one of the two trained doctors in America to go to Bassa goes unmet. And the people who are sent to Bassa refuse to disperse. And above all, they won't abide by, they're not prepared to abide by the one principle for care in Liberia that the white American Colonization Society doctor has worked out, which is to put everybody basically in a hospital care, to make them rest, to get assistance to them, whether it's quinine or something more stronger, immediately when they show some symptoms. And he's found just by experience, this works. Well, these people are dispersed, there's no doctor care. The regular American Colonization Society doctor refuses to go there because they're divided. And it winds up that, Virgil is caught in the middle of this there. So it's not only a place, it's a place to go to that's already infested with malaria. They all are, but it's a place where the best principle of care for those people is forgot there. And even the medicines that are supposed to go to these folks to take care, to come over in the ship with them, are diverted by the president's brother, who is a doctor who wants it all for the people he's caring for in Monrovia. So it's a setup. Virgil doesn't know it, and I don't think he ever knows how badly it was set up. And it's a setup for disaster, and it's a disaster. This is ultimately the worst disaster in Liberian history. 2 out of every 3 people die. Now it's normal in the 1830s for 1820s and 1830s for maybe a third of the people to die. Sometimes half the people die, but 2 out of 3, it's a catastrophe there, and the people on the scene say it's a catastrophe.
Right. And then I was going to say, and then he gets the record for probably the shortest stay in Liberia, right? Because he is on the next boat back.
Well, the other next boat's back, but it turns out that some of the people recognized that on the boat coming over, that Virgil was a doctor they could trust, that he knew what he was doing. And some of those few people, 134 people went with him. None of them died. So he is a medical success in Liberia. Now, he's the benefit of his skill, which is comparable to the kind of treatment that works in Africa. And he's a benefit of scale. Few enough people, so he doesn't have lots of people to take care of. So he can go from person to person. And I think when they trust a doctor, you say, what you need is rest. You can't get up and go. It'll just aggravate the fever. So those two things work in his favor, his skill and his scale. But Virgil's a success medically in Liberia, but still, he does come back. Okay, he comes back,
and he talks about it. That's, I think, what the American Colonization Society is the most upset about, right? That he actually talks and says Bassa is a disaster.
So the American Colonization Society has more papers than any source I've ever worked with. It turns out that turned out to be my attic trunk that I hadn't expected.
Yeah,
they're all on microfilm, and I spent months in the University of Denver library, bless them, using microfilm on interlibrary loan, cranking through microfilm, which is organized in a very peculiar way, to get to what happened to Virgil and what happened to those other passengers in Liberia. That was my attic trunk. And what happened was that Virgil comes back to Baltimore, which is the port that he left from. And what happens then? Well, you would think, okay, well, I'm back. At least I've cleared Liberia.
Right.
Uh, but immediately he and three other survivors and the captain of the ship start broadcasting. This is a
Mhm.
disaster. Liberia is a death trap. And it turns out that the local agent of the American Colonization Society is sick. And the chief agent is in Washington. He writes to the chief agent in Washington, William McLean, and he says, "Can you get here fast? I'm too sick to counter these guys' statements, but they're killing us here because they say Liberia's a killer.
Yeah.
And I think you should fire the captain and, write the owner of these other people, shut him up somehow, and stop that Virgil, that NC doctor, as he calls him, from broadcasting this news." So Virgil starts there in Baltimore, and then he goes back to North Carolina
Right.
to tell North Carolina the story. And of course, it's North Carolina whites that he's
Yeah.
telling the story to. He's not going to tell blacks who might be thinking about being sent to Liberia. He can't do that. He can't undermine these, but he thinks still of masters of conscience will
Mhm.
respond. If you're going to send people to Liberia, you must have some conscience. For
Right.
God's sake, don't send them there. Send them someplace else. Send them to the north, but not to Liberia. So it's a pretty bold move
Mhm.
on his part to do it. And I think he still thinks of himself as a person not just trusted by the Camerons and by Bennehan, but by other
Mhm.
people, and that they will listen to it. And some do.
Yeah, that's just so crazy when you got to that point in the book, and you're kind of like he's going back to his old master, right? I don't think we can't tell if he actually met with Cameron or not, but he definitely was in the region, and it's just so fascinating that he goes back to that place where he was enslaved for so long, right? And like it
Hey,
speaks to that
but
paradox.
how do you? It isn't. It's one more. If you don't like paradox, don't read this book. But yeah, it's another paradox there. Um, so it's not just his master. It's not just Paul Cameron that he is conveying this
Mhm.
message to. It's everybody in Raleigh
Yeah.
other owners, slave owners who will listen to him. And as you mentioned, the American Colonization Society leader, William McLean, knows he's going back, knows the message he's going to carry, and sends an agent down there to basically provide disinformation. Says, Virgil's exaggerating, and Virgil never worked a day in his life, and that's why he left Liberia, and
Mm.
all of that to smear him. Not an old pattern made new, or a new pattern recognizing the old. But they listen to him. And then, as you point out, what's next? Okay, he's this is a doctor. He's actually speaking as an enslaved man. He's speaking as someone who is freed. He's speaking as someone who's been to Liberia. He's freed as a freed man. He's taking this message back. What then? And
Yeah.
Paul Cameron, his owner, who had taken him to Baltimore, seen him on the boat to Liberia. Paul Cameron, his owner, claims after the Civil War that he asked to be re-enslaved,
Mhm.
come back to slavery. He pleaded to come back to slavery. And at first, this is in a book by a man who was a slave owner. He lost two enslaved women, one very publicly, one very privately. The woman he lost publicly was one named Jane Johnson, uh, who snatched off a boat in Philadelphia just before he takes her to South America as an ambassador.
Mm.
And another woman is a man named Hannah Crafts, whom Greg Kasimovich has just uncovered as the
Mm.
author of the first novel ever written by a former enslaved woman. Um, so this guy has taken a hit, and his book is basically designed. Slavery was really better than that. These two women were the exceptions, etc. That's the context of his story. So there's every reason not to believe
Mhm.
this tale. On the other hand, um, I think that I found as I began to look at some other stories and other books, recent books, that Virgil wouldn't have been the only person to ask for re-enslavement. That there were people in
Right.
Virginia who asked. There were fugitive slaves who didn't leave the South, just stayed around the cities. Viola Miller has done a book called Escape to the Cities,
Yeah.
and Ted Maris Wolfe has done Family Bonds, and that's the key.
Mm.
That is, those family people that Virgil mentioned, two brothers and an aunt in his letter, and those 14 people he mentioned by name, and the 100 more he could mention. These
Mm.
are his friends, and
Yeah.
certainly the friends of his wife and his wife's nephew and his niece. And so when you put it in that context, he's not going back to slavery,
Yeah.
as
Mm.
bondage it is, but he's also going back to family, to friends, to the world he knew, and to the world he could manage, and the world where he could keep people alive, and where, of course, he could be still back to his old role as a plantation doctor. So a place
Yeah.
where he did a lot of good there.
Mm.
So I think that it makes sense that it's not as fanciful as it seems at first,
Yeah.
that he would want to go back. And so I basically argue that he does. And then the question is, why has he refused there?
Yeah.
So that too. But that's the context, I think, for looking
Mhm.
at, and Joseph Miller, again, the former historian at the University of Virginia, says, and Viola Miller highlights this, says that we can't assume that what we would want for enslaved people, freedom, is their
Mhm.
first priority. They have other priorities. And
Yeah.
after all, what is freedom? Is freedom Liberia? I mean, that's 2,000, 3,000 miles away.
Mhm.
Is freedom the North? Hell, they're trying to get people out of Baltimore, and how is Frederick Douglass treated there? So
Mhm.
it's not as rosy as it looks when you consider what they do have and what their priorities might be, and which he argues their priorities were.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, when you're in a drift, it's in a drift, right? The situation where you're not sure what to do is like what you do, what you know, where your medical knowledge means nothing, like a city of Baltimore. It's hard.
And I suggest he knew a little bit about Baltimore from a very short time there, and he could
Yeah.
see from another time there that uh, freedom in Baltimore was basically, even then, being constricted by massive immigration of Germans and Irish who were going after jobs that blacks once had as caulkers and steam and boatmen and things of that sort. Frederick Douglass experienced this as early as 1838, being rocked by these guys who didn't want him to be taking their jobs, as they put it.
Yeah. Yeah. So how did you then discover him in California?
Okay, so California, here we come.
Go west.
Well, here's the deal. I I didn't I didn't know how I was going to if I was going to find him ever again. But I thought I had plenty of evidence that these two people who were the agents of the American Colonization Society, one lived in Baltimore, one lived in Washington, wrote to each other every day and were totally candid with each other,
Hmm.
that they took an animus to Virgil.
Mhm.
The guy in Baltimore, because Virgil's executor, one of his executors, was pushing to get Virgil on a boat that was already full. And he started pulling rank. He wrote a congressman. He wrote the editor of the
Hmm.
paper of Washington. And so the guy said, "Okay, we'll put him on there somehow." But I think he was angry about that. And then, of course, William McLean, the head of the American Colonization Society, was angry at Virgil because Virgil was telling the truth about
Hmm.
Liberia, which he continued to deny. He continued to deny that there was. He said, Liberia is the safest place in the world. He said it's a lot much safer than any place in America. I mean, he kept at it. So both of them had an animosity toward Virgil, and they both thought. One said, he's just a guy who's gotten higher than he should. He thinks more of himself than he really is, which is, in other words, he got above his station. So I thought, well, maybe they'll continue to be on the alert. And I thought, by that point, I thought Virgil was still in Baltimore, because Virgil winds up in the census listed in the census of Baltimore by a
Mhm.
census taker who comes by his residence and the residence of his wife and his nephew and his niece in July 31st, 1850. So he said he was going to Baltimore in 1849. He's enlisted in Baltimore in July of 1850. Now, so maybe he didn't make it, but at least they would pay attention. So I kept reading their letters, and sure enough, at the bottom of one of the letters in 1851, January 1851, the agent in Baltimore has a PS, and he has a little clipping which he appends to the letter, which is, thank God, readable in microfilm. Is this your Virgil? And the clipping is from the Baltimore Sun, people who have died in California.
Mhm.
Virgil Bennehan, age 41, November 1850.
Mhm.
That was how I learned that Virgil got to California, and that was how I learned that Virgil died in California. And at that point, he lists, then there's a next newspaper, and I saw who listed him, a coroner, and the current where the coroner lived. And the coroner sort of lists all the deaths in a little part of San Francisco, which is called Little Chile. Then it's still called Little Chile in some little plaques, but it's Chinatown now. Um, and so I looked at, okay, who were the other people who were listed and who were buried? And I went to the Alta California, the newspaper, and there is Virgil listed in a digitized version of the newspaper. And then the coroner doesn't list Virgil. So I thought he dies, but he's not buried in Yura Buena, which is the cemetery then, the public cemetery.
Mhm.
Um, and I said, was that because he's a man of color? But no, there were people who were listed specifically as
Mhm.
colored, COL, comma, who were buried there. So it's not that. And then I found out you had to have $25 to get buried there. And, so I put it all together, trying to put together what happened to him, and finally decided he died. He died a pauper. He was buried in a pauper's grave.
Mhm.
And then looked at the weather and the conditions in Liberia, in San Francisco, to try to put together what happened to him then. But then, as I went back to try to figure out, well, when did he get to San Francisco? And figured out that even though he was listed in the census of 1850 in January 31st, he didn't have to be present to be listed.
Mhm.
His wife could have listed him, and she listed him as a speculator. And I
Mhm.
thought, speculator, a speculator, and he had money. He did have money, but a speculator's got to have money in Baltimore for real estate or for trade.
Mhm.
It could have been that. But then I looked in the newspapers, and that's what those guys who went to California were called, speculators. And you find them called speculators or adventurers. And I thought, uh-huh. So he could be a speculator or an adventurer in California,
Mhm.
but listed in the census of Baltimore. And more speculation. But then I had a little bit of confirmation from another source, city directory of, of 1850, which doesn't list him as residing at the same address. So I thought,
Mhm.
and that was conducted before the that was conducted just after the census. And I thought,
Mhm.
but did he get to San Francisco between January 31st and August 31st? And I thought that didn't make any sense. So it, I just kept looking there. But the short answer to your question, have I given you a short answer yet, Neil?
I'm
Short
okay
answer,
with that.
short answer to your that's a different guy you have to interview. The short answer to your question is it was just a PS in a letter from one agent of the Colonization Society to the other that told me when he died and that the information would be in the Alta, California. And then I went back to that and found out it was a congestive fever, and then concluded basically it's a form of malaria that he contacted. So this is a man who leaves the country for freedom, and he winds up in a place that's full of malaria, and where most of the people are poor, where he can't get paid for the doctoring he does do, and he goes to San Francisco to try his luck, and he winds up dying of malaria in a pauper there. So poor Virgil turns out to be the apt two-word
Yeah.
description for how his story comes out. Uh, so it's not a happy ending, and yet I thought, in some way, does it represent
Mm.
a larger story, and that's where I sort of had to work uh, to deal with that and to recognize first that this is a story of tragedy, but in a sense, if you pull focus a little bit, that how many of these stories of emancipation, which did lead to exile,
Mhm.
uh, wind up with the stories that we like to read about, that I like to write about, uh,
Right.
whether it's Hannah Krauss or whether it's Harry Jacobs or whether it's Mary Walker or Paul Hargis or any of those stories. How many of them did involve limits and exile and
Mhm.
suffering and disappointment, and then projecting larger story after emancipation? Uh, how many stories there, where people have high expectations and then sort of run into the limits, into the walls that are around them. So
Mhm.
I and I as I trace that. I asked, well, where did Virgil had lived, and I trace out the stories of two people who were his shipmates. There were two free blacks who went over from the
Mhm.
Midwest to scout Liberia, now an independent country, to see whether they would recommend it for themselves and for their families and for other free blacks who were facing increasing racism in the North. Uh,
Mhm.
I looked at what happened to them and what happened to their descendants and found uh, patterns that I think also suggested that the feeling of being in exile, even in your own land, persisted
Mhm.
after emancipation. And
Right.
then I found a great quote, unexpected, from Martin Luther King. This is after the book came out. Uh, and Martin Luther King, the great speech, I Have a Dream speech. But
Mhm.
the preface to that dream is, 100 years ago, he repeats, he's, of course, a preacher. 100 years ago, we were emancipated. 100 years ago, bright light of freedom came on. 100 years ago, and now 100 years from then it's segregation. 100 years from then it's this. And he says, and he ends that quotation, which is the preface to the paragraph we all know: the Negro is still in exile in his own land. But I thought, well, maybe this story is not just Virgil's story.
Mhm. And you kind of took exactly the question I was going to ask next already into your answer, because I was kind of wanting to s- ask, kind of wanted to get your thoughts of like, Virgil's a very interesting character. He travels a lot. He has this special treatment on the plantation. He has a lot of opportunities. He seeks re-enslavement. He seeks opportunities, right? And part of me is sort of like, he's not the rule, right? He's not the rule. He's not the typical slave on a plantation. But then, as we usually say, right, that old saying, like, the exception makes the rule. So how much does that then kind of confirm some of the things that we know about the plantation and the environments there? But I'm kind of thinking in a larger sense also here with regard to your book, right? When we look at these exceptions, how does that change the way we think about slavery?
Well, I think first, the are many stories on the plantation. And I've again followed Joseph Miller and think he wants us to tell them all. Okay,
Yeah.
they're not just one plantation, not just one experience. He says we need to follow the experience of people who were enslaved wherever those stories lead us.
Yeah.
We need to follow the stories of so-called masters wherever those stories lead us. And I think in the case of Virgil's story, if you just look at where he starts and where he ends, you can see, I think, the dynamic, the non-static quality of the experience of slavery and the experience of mastery. So he starts out in a plantation where it expands adjacently. There's illness. He becomes a doctor and he has a special role. But then in the middle, another person comes into the play, Paul Cameron, uh, and he starts out okay, but then he expands to Alabama and he changes the terms of the plantation. And then in 1848, the very year that Virgil goes to Liberia, there is a woman, Mary Walker, who escaped slavery. And as far as Paul Cameron is concerned, that breaks his sense of faith in the most privileged. That breaks his sense of trust. So I see the impact on Virgil of each of these transformative moments in the plantation's history. It's a plantation that moves. It's a plantation that it's also a microcosm, if I can use that micro historical word, a microcosm of the larger currents, expansion of slavery to the West, and then escapes of slavery. We know what happens to some of these people who escape slavery, now called freedom seekers. And we know the sort of macro consequences of those escapes, the fugitive slave law, and then all the controversy that comes after that, the Wilmot Proviso, and finally the Civil War. But what's the internal impact of the escape on a plantation? What does it do to disrupt the fictions that everybody's living with? I had one person who listened to me yarn about this, and she said, we all live with fictions, and at some point they fail. And I would see that on this plantation, the transformation over time, it's not static, it moves. And then it challenges the fictions here. And even when Virgil comes back in 1849, the escape of Mary Walker, I assert, has changed the attitude toward having a formerly trusted slave back. And I know I have confirmation of this because when he proposes getting a nurse to take care of an ill sister who's going to Philadelphia, he says, well, I wouldn't trust any of our people. That trust is broken. So this kind of, these are big things, escape, expansion, that are influencing Virgil's life. He's a kind of weathercock for all of this. And it really, I think, illustrates what Joseph Miller's talking about. It's not static. And the form of mastery is not static. And the experience of slavery is not static either for Virgil, even for a privileged man like Virgil. And I would say this is true for freedom, really. But those are some of the larger takeaways I would see in this micro history. Big stories, small, the expansion, escape, the transformation of a possibility of being a conscientious slaveholder, and all of these possibilities, these fictions, these bubbles, whatever you want to call them, really being challenged by some of the conflicting goals that you find on the plantation.
I was just like, as you were talking, my mind wandered, and I was sort of like, I wonder how Cameron told the other enslaved people on the plantation that Virgil was gone, right? Because that's sort of right. Like, how do you explain to everyone there that he has now his freedom and he's going to leave the country? And of course, then a year later, he shows back up. Wow.
You've stumped me.
Yeah,
I don't.
just, I didn't
Well,
expect you to answer it. I just kind of was like, wow.
it's
Well, I hope they didn't
it's
tell him he died.
here's a long time ago, a wonderful friend and historian named Charles Joyner, who wrote really a great book on South Carolina black culture on the plantation. He made a little video, and the little video, one part of it was about an enslaved man who was freed by his owner, and it's a fantasy story. This guy was a wrestler, and the owner lost some money in a gambling match, and had his wrestler put up against his rival's wrestler, and the winner takes all. Okay, and so the wrestler says, "Hey, what do I get out of it?" This is the fantasy, right? This is the video. And he says, "What do I get out of it?" He says, "Well, I hadn't thought about that." He says, "Well, I thought about it. I want my freedom." Says, John. He says, "Well, the other master won't be so unhappy if I lose." And he said, "Okay, John, and for my 4 sons." And he says, whoa, it's not what it in writing. Okay. So all of this happened. So then John goes out and he tells some of the other enslaved people, and at least in the fantasy, they're kind of cheering John on, at least somebody's going to get away.
No.
But I think your question is, were they all cheering him on? Well, maybe so. But let's say that at least they could say, well, one of us has gotten away. One of us has gotten away. And
Mm-hmm.
who knows? Maybe he'll be able to help us. But at least we can all feel some gratitude that he has gotten away. So that might be the way in which Cameron would try to frame it, and that he would say, his owner owed him a lot, and that he's going to go free and go to Liberia and put the best possible case on it and hope that they would fill in the rest or not.
Oh,
That would be my guess as to how he
well,
might frame
yeah. Well, it's speculation.
it. Yeah, but it's a great question. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, well, that's the beauty of sometimes these conversations that all of a sudden something comes up where you're like, oh. But
Yeah.
we have been talking for almost an hour and a half, and I think we covered Virgil's life enough to whet people's appetite to read the book and kind of explore the footnotes of all the speculation that you have included. So it was a great pleasure to have you today, Sid, and kind of talk about Virgil's life and the intricacies of researching a person that only left you one good letter and writing a whole biography about some. It was great.
Research and you shall research and you shall find. I still believe in that.
That ought to be the term for every research class.
And thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the chance to talk about Virgil and to get acquainted with you in two
It,
two continents.
yeah, it was wonderful. And just for our listeners, if you are now interested in Sid's book, it is Freedom's Mirage, Virgil Benneham's Odyssey from Exile to from sorry, I'm going to do that a second time. Freedom's Mirage, Virgil Benneham's Odyssey from Emancipation to Exile. There we go. And it came out with the University of North Carolina Press. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you.